Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Free Library of Philadelphia, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. We are so deeply honored to have with us the chief theater critic of the New York Times, Jesse Green, who very graciously agreed to be interviewed. So I'm going to introduce him right now, and then we're going to jump in and get started. So, since this podcast originates in Philadelphia, I feel obligated to say that Jesse Green is a great example of a local man who really made good. And for our local audience, I want to point out that Jesse was born in Jefferson Hospital and is a graduate of Harrington High in Rosemont. While he was a high school student, he directed and/or appeared in countless productions, including You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, and Play It Again, Sam. His very first job in journalism was as an intern in Philadelphia Magazine. Well, today, in addition to his position at the New York Times, he is the author of an incredible book called Shy, the alarmingly outspoken memoirs of Mary Rogers. And I want to say that if you have not read this New York Times bestseller, you've got an enormous treat in store for you. And in fact, as a librarian, I order you to either buy or borrow this book sometime during the weekend. From 2013 to 2017, Jesse Green was the theater critic for New York Magazine, where he was a contributing editor. And prior to that, he had written pieces on theater and American culture for the arts and leisure section of the New York Times. This is while also contributing to the magazine. Jesse Green is a graduate of Yale College and holds degrees in both journalism and theater. And Jesse, my first question to you is, how is the American theater going to change or evolve in response to the second Donald Trump presidency?
Well, you might as well ask, how is the country going to respond to the second Donald Trump presidency? No one knows, but many of us are concerned. We wonder, we've been talking a lot at the Times, and we are hearing from people in the theater, a lot of concern about, basics like, will there be funding? The president has already made it clear that he intends to defund much of the cultural programming through its grant-making institutions. But that had already gone away for the most part with theater, so that might not have such an effect. There's a concern about the chilling effect on the theater based on the administration's views about diversity and inclusion and reporting and tattletaling on people who still speak the forbidden words of equality. And of course, the theater is the place, at least in recent decades, where that has been, that has been the conversation. Since I've been a critic, the top subject in the theater, and rightly so, has been diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I'm not saying that these are lectures, but the issues that have taken our country decades and centuries to really face are the ones that the theater is speaking about so much. And I think there's a great deal of concern about whether it can continue to do so and attract the kind of support it needs to continue, which is on top of the fact that the theater has been in a very precarious situation ever since COVID.
Jesse, one of the things I guess that I was thinking about related to Trump is that if you use the 1930s and the 1960s as a sort of template, I guess I was imagining that Donald Trump just might inspire some of the greatest theater work, some of the greatest plays, musicals, other things theater related that we've ever seen. I mean, do you also foresee that as a possibility?
Well, not immediately. It takes a long time to develop shows, and even beyond that, there's the famous line about literature, poetry being emotion recollected in tranquility. It takes a certain amount of emotional time to process what's going on and to create great art from it. Now, will there be immediate responses in the theater? Yes, there already have been. I mean, even in the first administration and continuing in the interregnum, there were immediately there were satires and broadsides, and those have their purpose and can be fun, or they can serve as a rallying cry, which is another reasonable aim of the theater. But in terms of great art, in terms of great drama, it's harder to take an immediate political situation and make that happen. I think a lot of those works that you're thinking about actually came a little bit later than the events that provoked them. But there's also the problem of how do you dramatize a character like Trump? He's self-dramatizing. That is his modus operandi. He wants to be a character. And so it's really hard to do anything that's more than he's already doing himself. Not to get too political about it, but the shows I've seen in which Trump himself has been a character have not come anywhere close to revealing anything more about him than he reveals every day by himself.
Jesse, could you tell us something about the worst moments that you endured in all the years that you've been a theater critic?
Oh my gosh. Well, I guess there's a couple ways to answer that. There's things that I endured that are personally distasteful to me, but other people, might well have liked. For instance, I'm not a big fan of stage violence. It is occasionally called for, but when it's used gratuitously, I react badly to it. I don't like it in movies either, but seeing it on stage feels like a greater violation because it's live, and even though it's fake, it's happening right in front of you. And I won't say the name of the play, but there was a play that concerned a mass murder in an editorial office of a journalistic publication, much like many of the ones I had worked in. And I really was incapacitated by it, and I still had to write a review of it. So there's that kind of experience. And then there's just things that are so absolutely terrible in their own right, that almost anyone could see that they were terrible. And you're just miserable because as a theater critic, you don't really want to be telling people that the theater is bad, but it is part of the job. And a lot of theater is bad. So you're thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do this? How am I going to explain how bad it is without being too mean? And yet I don't want to put people through a slog of a time reading my review. I want my reviews to be fun. So, that ranges from, there was a musical of King Kong a few years ago that was, the animatronic 60-foot puppet was the most expressive thing about it. The humans were completely inexpressive. And, there was a new Andrew Lloyd Webber musical this year called Bad Cinderella. It had been called Cinderella in London, and they added the word bad for Broadway. And I'm like, are you really asking for this? And the reviews were horrible. So there's that. But I think the worst time I have in the theater is the meh kind of time where I it's okay. It's sort of like a mid-level Netflix show maybe, but it neither raises crucial issues or affects the emotions profoundly, nor offends. So there's really very little to say about it. And when I'm in the theater, a lot of what I'm thinking about is what am I going to say? Because I have very little time to figure that out.
In preparation for our meeting this morning, I read about 10 of your reviews. And one of the things that really struck me when I read them is that you, unlike so many of your predecessors, seem genuinely reluctant to hurt people's feelings and to ever say anything that could be perceived as being cruel. And gosh, when I think about the sort of the inherent power of the chair that you occupy and the way your predecessors or some of your predecessors have chosen to exercise it, that really strikes me as remarkable. I mean, that you should be so deeply concerned about not hurting other people's feelings.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I'm not sure I could find a single person in the theater who would agree with you about my being careful about people's feelings. I do feel like I try very hard to be careful about that, but it doesn't matter how careful I am. They're artists, they're sensitive, so they find slights everywhere. What I will say is this: I almost never go after an actor. It is never their fault. It is almost never their fault. Whatever's happening that isn't right, the talent is at such a high level. And in any case, maybe they were probably misdirected or the material wasn't good enough. It's not that they're not trained or they're not doing a good job. And I feel like it's inappropriate to go after them, let alone, as you know, some famous critics in the past would attack actors for their looks, or they would make nasty puns about their last names. They would just, it was like junior high school. And I don't go near any of that. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the argument of the play, and the actors are the kind of the last element in that. And if there's a problem, it has happened before the actors stepped on top of that cake to do the work. So the actors are pretty much off limits. I describe performances, and I will sometimes say somebody wasn't convincing, but I'm not going to say a bad actor. They'll be great in the next show. I am pretty hard, though, on writers and directors. And the reason is because my interest, as I said, is in the argument. My interest is, what does the author want us to experience? How well does the director help us to experience that? And is it worth experiencing in the first place? Those are my top criteria, and that falls always to the writer and the director. And I could show you late night emails from both playwrights and directors who would not agree with the premise of your question, but that's fine. It's understandable. They put years sometimes into these works, and I have 1 or 2 days to respond to them.
In every profession, there are certain behaviors that are unethical and outrageous. For example, as a librarian, I mean, to knowingly give misinformation to a member of the public, I mean, that's considered malpractice, and that's a very serious thing. As I try, I mean, to understand or to project the potential sins of a critic, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is submitting a review of a show you haven't seen. I mean, it's hard to imagine something more awful than that. But what are some of the other things that, given your personal standards and the standards of the New York Times, would amount to malpractice on the part of a critic?
Well, you certainly name one of them, and I guess I would add, adjunct to that one, maybe being at the show but not really being there, like falling asleep. I mean, sometimes these things can't be helped, I suppose, but there are well-known cases of critics being at a show but in no condition to review it. And that feels like a sin to me. There are very specific ones that the Times rightly imposes on us as critics, even though many other publications do not. So let's say there's a play, and someone who's in it or someone who wrote it is someone I know. Well, at what level does it become a conflict of interest for me to write about that play? We have very strict rules about conflict of interest in covering political subjects, and they apply also to cultural subjects. So if I'm not sure about the level of connection to somebody involved in the show, then I bring this to my editor and to the standards team, and they make a ruling as to whether I can review it. And if they say you better not, then I don't, we reassign it to one of the freelancers. So that's a kind of a sin, and it's not that I would intentionally want to overpraise someone just because I met them at or went to college with them, or underpraise them because I never liked them. It's that it becomes difficult for me to tell what I'm doing. And so I appreciate the care the Times takes to make sure that there's not the appearance of a conflict of interest. Beyond that, I would say it's a sin to not know your subject. I've spent, long before I was a critic, I've spent my whole life going to theater and thinking about it, and it was one of my two majors at college, and I worked in the theater for many years before I became a journalist. And I'm troubled when I read criticism sometimes by the evident lack of understanding of the way theater is put together, how difficult it is to do it at all. So I think a certain amount of knowing your beat is really important. But I guess I would say, and this is very abstract, for me, the top sin is the same top sin for the theater itself, which is to be boring. And I don't want to see boring plays, and I don't want to write boring reviews. So the first job of a critic is to be an entertaining writer.
So, Jesse, taking into account, that you're not a historian, you're not a sociologist, this question has been sort of running around in my brain, and I guess I have to acknowledge here that both our guest and the host here just happen to be Jewish. But it sort of seems to me that it's impossible to imagine Broadway in its modern incarnation without the participation of Jews in a number of important different roles. And what I wanted to ask you is, from your perspective, is there something in the Jewish experience or Jewish history that might account for the fact that so many Jewish people have been involved in Broadway and in theater, I think probably as far back as it goes?
Well, certainly the American theater is very heavily a Jewish creation, or at least as we think of it. I'm very interested in this subject, and not to promote anything, but I did write a very long piece about this for T Magazine, which is the style magazine of the New York Times, I guess about a year or two ago, about the creation of the American theater by immigrant Jews. So I strongly recommend, if anyone is interested in that subject, to read my take on it and then read other people's takes on it. It is really, it has always interested me and baffled me to some degree, what you're raising. But then also, how did Impressionism arise among a bunch of Parisian bohemians at a certain moment in time? How did jazz come out of the experiences and talent of a bunch of Black Americans at a certain time? These are movements that are sparked by a condition, perhaps, and of course talent, but also by a community of like-minded people who get on the same train at the same time. So it's not random exactly, but it's very hard to find what are the key elements. In terms of the Jews in the theater, especially in America, you have to look at the Yiddish theater, which was one of the few things the Jews, when they came to America from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, could bring with them. They had room for a few pots and pans. We've all seen Fiddler on the Roof. They had room for a little bit of the mother's jewelry, if they had any, and some goose down pillows, like my grandmother. But that's it. But what they could bring was their cultural heritage, and the Yiddish theater in the shtetls and in the towns of Eastern Europe was an extremely important cultural factor and achievement, and became a very important industry parallel to Broadway in New York. Many of the same shows, although in Yiddish, where you could see in the Yiddish Broadway, you could see Shakespeare in Yiddish and all of that. And this led to the development of a coterie of American Jews who then went on to change the theater. All of the original major acting teachers were first generation immigrants from Eastern Europe of Jewish extraction. And then they taught what they knew. And that became the basis of the American theater. Beyond that, maybe you can talk about in musicals, the cantorial tradition. A lot of the great Jewish composers of American musical theater had fathers who were cantors or who were themselves cantors and were raised around, liturgical music. Even Cole Porter, who was totally not a Jew, said that the secret to writing a hit was to write a Jewish tune. So there's something to that, but it's a worthy subject of a book, and I've only written an article. So that's my little foretaste of it.
Okay. So, Jesse, at this point, I wanted to pause for a minute and say to those of us in our audience who I know already by this point must be bursting with questions, to submit a question for Jesse, look for the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. That's where you want to go to type a question for him. And we're keeping a careful eye on the time. And so Jesse will respond to as many of your questions as we have time for. But first, you have to ask them. I know you've got them. So Jesse, in thinking about this interview, it occurred to me that I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what you, as a theater critic, owe your readers.
Well, that's a great question. And it's one that my readers and I debate quite a lot, because the value and purpose of criticism is really under fire these days, in part because people have a million new ways to receive information about the culture, many of which do not involve newspapers or magazines, many of which do not involve people who have studied or have very much experience or are writers. That doesn't mean that their responses are invalid. It means it's different. So there's a kind of struggle going on between the traditional idea of criticism and the social media dominated idea of criticism, and a confusion between what each of them can and should do. So I tell people, particularly when they're angry because I didn't like a show they liked, or because I did like a show they didn't like, which also happens, that it's not my job to predict their response. I don't know what their response will be. There's a million people who read some of these reviews, or hundreds of thousands in some cases anyway, and they all likely would have their own different response. I can't really go to that. I also don't believe there is an objective reaction to a piece of art. There is only subjectivity, and there's only taste informed by experience, writing ability, and research and knowledge. So I think of myself as a reporter when I'm writing reviews, but what I'm reporting on is my response. I'm not reporting on anyone else's response. The whole audience could be standing up and cheering and dancing, and if I'm having a bad time, I'm going to write about that. I may mention that there are other responses, especially if there's a dramatic and obvious difference between mine and those of people around me. But, these days people stand up at shows no matter how bad they are. It's not proof of anything. I get so many emails. You must hate the theater. Everyone in there was clapping and standing. And I'm like, yeah, I really went into this because I hate the theater. I hate it so much that I want to see hundreds of shows a year and spend all of my time thinking about it and writing about it. So, that's not the case. But people have some people believe that criticism is a form of boosterism for the industry or for people they know in show business. And some people believe that criticism is a holding to account of new work against the qualities learned from old work. And that's where I stand. And I do it by reporting on my response by focusing strongly on, as I said, on the argument of the work. Even if it's a musical comedy, it's trying to do something, and you can examine how well does it do it in comparison to other works and in comparison to your own taste. Beyond that, there's nothing I can say. Your taste should be celebrated, and you can enjoy what I don't enjoy. The purpose of my criticism isn't to tell you what to think, but I hope it gives you an idea as you get to know me as a critic, or just as I got to know when I was young, reading Pauline Kael on the movies or Horrible John Simon on plays. I didn't agree with everything they said, or I didn't even know if I'd ever see those shows. And some of what John Simon said was highly objectionable to me insofar as he was sort of blatantly misogynistic and racist and homophobic. But the writing was so good that I could get to understand, oh, he likes that, but I wouldn't. Or he doesn't like this, but I would. And that's what I think criticism ought to do. It should allow you to triangulate with the critic and to figure out your own taste. I don't want to tell you what your taste is. I want you to figure it out.
I wanted to ask you about Eugene O'Neill, because I guarantee you that as we're having this conversation at a university somewhere, they're already planning the next academic conference to focus, I guess, on either the life or the works of Eugene O'Neill. And I wanted to ask you why it is, at least to the best of my knowledge, and maybe I'm simply wrong, but it seems to me that in terms of a legacy where his shows are still being performed and people still go, and average theater goers, I mean, are involved in discussing that Eugene O'Neill has become the great disappearing man of American theater, or am I wrong about that?
You're not really wrong. I think there's other great disappearing men and plenty of long disappeared women who never got to appear, who are being rediscovered, and that's been wonderful. Um, O'Neill, in particular, is a problem as our cultural habits have changed, and that change has accelerated since the pandemic. The Netflix revolution. People expect to take in their culture in an easier format, and also, in a less costly format. And it becomes harder for producers, who, after all, are not in the business to lose money, to make a case for work that is difficult to stage, that tends to be quite long, that often has a large cast, although, Eugene O'Neill also wrote one-person plays or two-person plays, and, that they can't guarantee that there's an audience for. So, it is still a commercial business. Yes, on campus, you're still going to be studying O'Neill and Williams and Albee and Odets and Miller. But each year, it seems we see a little less of them, although Miller remains pretty stable because of he's ripe politically for thinking about our time. And the great Williams plays are done pretty frequently. But you're right, O'Neill, there was a production of Huey on Broadway not so long ago, and something else with Nathan Lane, but they were presented as special events. And I think he's just very difficult. And people maybe aren't into that kind of difficulty as much as they were before, or their diet of theater was so wide and it didn't cost them so much that, that was part of what you did in the next night. you saw Guys and Dolls.
I wanted to talk a little bit about civil rights because it occurs to me that while the issues and concerns of past civil rights eras, have never gone away. Those concerns and those needs are very much with us today, involving African Americans, women, Native Americans. But it sort of seems to me as though the burning civil rights crusade or campaign of our time is that is focused on the trans community. And you can really see America and Americans uh, struggling with this. And what sort of grade would you give Broadway to date in terms of how they have addressed or really failed to address those particular issues?
Well, I wouldn't even grade Broadway. I mean, Broadway is a commercial institution or a group of institutions, and it has never been the place where the first alarms are sent or the first ideas are presented about changes that are happening in our world. Because when those changes are beginning, they're small and hard to understand and are dealt with among smaller audiences. So we would tend to see those off Broadway and off Broadway and regionally before they would ever get to Broadway. So to grade Broadway for that would be ridiculous, in my opinion, or you would just say it would totally fail. There's been recently a few musicals that feature characters who are non-binary or are performed by actors who are trans or non-binary. And that was at first a little bit problematic, but it seems to be regularized now. But there's no great examples on Broadway of a play or musical where that is the subject. However, I have been seeing over the last few years a fair number of plays on that subject off Broadway, and I think that's right. I think that's where you start that work and build an audience of people interested in this subject, not personally, because there's not enough people personally knowledgeable, but people who have an interest in humanity. And this is a corner of humanity that the theater has not previously covered or really even noticed or known about. So I'm okay with where that stands in terms of content brewing and growing. However, I will say that for trans performers, there are very few opportunities, and they rightly raise that as an issue since, there's been a lot of characters who could be conceived of or well played by trans or non-binary actors, and they are just not given the opportunity. So there's, as an employment issue, that's still quite a big problem. I think we're moving along in terms of the content issue. But, as we slice American society into finer and finer groups of identity, it becomes unclear how much the theater can address any one fine slice. To address a population that is, 20 to 40% of the country and or more non-white populations of Latino and Black and Native American, well, sure. And everyone should be interested in that. And I go to plays by Black authors about Black life, and I feel it's a privilege because I don't have access to that knowledge and those feelings in my little apartment right here because I'm not Black. But it becomes harder to see as you get these finer and finer slices how the theater can successfully and economically respond to them.
Jesse, one of the things that I wanted to ask you concerns the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, no woman has ever sat where you're sitting today. And so you are not the decision maker, but I did want to ask you why you feel that is the case.
Well, it's not quite true. If you mean a critic for the, a staff critic for the New York Times, there was a very fine critic named Margot Jefferson, who was the critic for a time, but briefly, and I guess didn't, achieve the name recognition, or you would have heard of her. And I certainly have plenty of colleagues, both at the Times and at other publications, who are critics who are women. But I think I don't want to avoid what you're really asking. I mean, I am the chief critic, and I am the sort of face of Times criticism in the theater, and I'm male. And that has, with little bits of exception, been the case. Why is that the case? Because women were excluded from journalism for most of that time as well. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that, women journalists, if they got to work for a newspaper, could only work for the food section or the society pages when there were society pages. So, times have had to change in order to find places for people who did not look like or identify as the things that newspapers were used to. I'm absolutely certain this is going to change. I assume that the person who follows me in the job will be a woman, and probably, or maybe not, a white woman, or will be not white, but male. I mean, I don't know. I think when I was hired, I asked the editor of the paper who hired me why they were hiring me. And he said to me, diversity isn't a one-to-one thing. It's not like it can't be based, you can't judge the diversity of an institution based on one job choice. And he pointed out, what the company was doing across the board. And there is the tension of like, who's available at this moment. There were critics who are not male and who are not white who turned the job down, I imagine. I'm not quite privy to that information. It's not a job everyone wants. But some of the best critics writing now are women, and some of the best critics writing now are not white. So I'm assuming that, by the time I retire, we're going to see a change. I just want to say one other thing, though. I think that's necessary and great. Although you notice I'm not like, giving up my job. So there's a limit to how much I think it's necessary and great. But I also want to say, for a woman critic, or a Black critic, or a Latino critic, or a trans critic, or me, the job will be to rise beyond our own identity, to, bring special information and knowledge and passion to things that address our identity because we know it. I've written a lot about Jewish plays and gay plays and other things that I'm interested in. I was trained in music, so I write a lot about music, whatever. But that will be necessary for the next person in the job too, to have the passion for their slice of identity, but to accept the challenge of theater, to care about everyone else's. And if my Black colleagues, they don't want to write only about plays by Black authors or about Black life. That's so limiting for them. It's tokenizing. Just as when I started at the New York Times and I just kept, before I was a critic, I was constantly assigned AIDS stories and gay stories. And, I wanted to do them because I cared about those things, but I didn't want to only do them. And I don't want my Black colleagues to be forced to not cover, O'Neill, as you brought up. I want them to have the same range of opportunity and passion that I'm allowed to have as a white man.
Jesse, I'm interested in the fact that the New York Times has film critics, it has book critics, it has music critics who cover everything from opera to rock and roll. The Times, I think, has developed a real reputation for incredible criticism in the area of architecture, interestingly. And yet, my perception as an average New York Times reader is that none of those critics comes even remotely close to the power that you wield, or that potentially, I mean, you could wield if you choose to. I think, in my own life, I mean, the movie critic, the lady, the chief movie critic of the Times, I do pay careful attention to what she says about films and whether she liked them or not. But that's sort of an exception. Why do you think that there seems to be a great gulf between the criticism and the sort of the power that someone in your situation wields, as opposed to the people who are book critics or music critics?
Well, first of all, I don't know if it's true that I wield as much power as you're giving me credit for. How would I judge that anyway? It's certainly not the case that I can close a show, as people say, because believe me, if I could, I would have. There's plenty of shows that I would like to see close immediately, but they keep going on because it's not just about my taste, and that's not what I'm doing. And furthermore, I don't. I feel like my best use is actually not to close something, but to bring something wonderful to the attention of people who would not otherwise hear of it. Just like if you read one of Manohla Dargis's film reviews about some small film, I assume you mean Manohla, but we also have Alyssa Wilkerson now. You like, oh, well, that sounds really good. That sounds like something I'd like. I'm going to go look for that. That's the most fun thing I can do. But let me taking you at your word that I have this power. I think the thing that distinguishes the theater as a subject within the many that the Times publishes criticism about, and we have more critics on staff than any publication, I believe, in the world, in various fields. I think we have something like 22 now. Is that the theater is lodged in this interesting position of being very important intellectually, culturally to our society, but being pretty small, and being economically queasy. So movies, are enormous, and there are hundreds of voices writing about them. And even in our paper, we have 2 chief critics for movies, and we have lots of other people writing about movies and freelance critics as well. And whereas, say, dance is very important also, but very small. The audience for it is very small, and we have a dance critic. It may be that she's the last staff dance critic on a newspaper in the country, as far as I know. And but that world that she covers is not. It's not as big as theater. So we're in between, whereby it is perceived that the Times can actually have a strong effect on what happens. Certainly they believe it does, the people working in it. And yet it's not so big a field that voice is diluted by the thousands of other people. So I think it's an economic matter. And maybe it's also to some extent a tradition matter, because the theater is a New York-based industry. None of the others are. Film and television are based on the West Coast. Architecture is based nowhere. Dance is based pretty much nowhere, but maybe New York. Art is around the world, but theater is heavily based in New York, both commercially and non-commercially. So much of what you see in the rest of the country has originated in New York. So with that in mind, I think the Times considers it a special beat, and has always promoted theater strongly among the arts, and is usually the first thing you see when you open Arts and Leisure will be the theater pages and things like that. So I think it's an artifact of economics and of history and of local New Yorkism that has created the effect you're talking about.
Okay. All right. So, Jesse, at this point, I've more than had my say, for which I'm very grateful. We have a lot of questions that have been piling up in the queue. So Let's go now and see what some of our audience members have to say. Uh, ah, one audience member asks, have you ever walked out on a show, either as a playgoer or as a critic?
As a critic, no. I could have added that to the list of sins. Uh, Unless I were to be sick, I mean, physically sick, I think it's a great disrespect to the performers to do that. And one thing I've learned from my time working in the theater is they can see you. I mean, they can see a lot of people. They can read the faces and they know where the critics are sitting. So for me to walk out would just be terrible. And likewise, though, I also try not to over respond because I don't, my opinion happens when I write my review. So I wouldn't say I keep a blank face and I laugh when it's appropriate or when I feel it, and I cry when I feel it, but I mostly want to signal presence. The idea of leaving is impossible to me. And I don't think I've ever done it, even not as a critic.
Okay. Vanessa has a really interesting question here. She asks, what's your dream for the American theater, aesthetically, business-wise, and as a value to society?
Oh, well, so those are at odds because, and it's a great question. Uh, Economically, I would like it to be more viable. You know, uh, Speaking about Broadway, which is a commercial industry, two-thirds of the shows produced on Broadway fail. And by fail, I mean they do not make back the investment that the investors have made in the show. That is a bad record. It's been that way for quite a while, and people still put money in. God bless them. And Broadway content ranges from brilliant to horrible and cheap and condescending, but it's still the place that puts the imprimatur of success on some really wonderful and serious or beautiful and entertaining works that makes them enter the culture and that allows them to live in the rest of the country. So it's important that Broadway, with all its dancing candlesticks and kitty cats, succeed. And I would love to see it succeed. However, I would love to see the economics of Broadway come into better control. It costs so much to put on even a small show that the ticket prices are too high for access to people who we need to draw into the theater. Off-Broadway has a different set of problems because it's non-commercial, and where do they get their money? And with the government the way it is, who knows what's going to happen? We see a lot of theaters closing off-Broadway and regionally, and that's a nightmare. However, the economic issue is in some ways at odds with the aesthetic issue that you raised, because I also want to see plays that draw on the best traditions of experimentation, of not only in theater but in all of the American arts. That in the 40s and 50s, you saw people writing plays and people writing musicals who were drawing on the recent literature, or people writing musicals who were drawing on the great playwrights to develop a new way of telling stories. And I want to see that experimentation continue. Where that traditionally happens is off Broadway, and off Broadway is in trouble. So my dream is that there's somebody fixes this, but as the wording of that implies, it's such a big problem that I don't think it will ever happen. I just hope we get through before too many theaters are forced to close.
Bob McWilliams has a really interesting and appropriate question. He says, have audiences gotten better, worse, or remain the same as compared to 20 or 30 years ago?
Wow. They're in terms of showing their enjoyment when they enjoy something, I guess if you consider that better, then they're better, because there is this thing that goes on with automatic standing ovations. And 30 years ago, it was very rare to have a standing ovation, least of all in a play. But even in musicals, maybe for a really, really wonderful it just wasn't the habit, and it still isn't the habit in London. Um, and there's a lot more kind of sort of art. It feels like artificial demonstrativeness of enjoyment because people have paid a lot of money and maybe have lubricated themselves a bit beforehand and are, guffawing louder than I can find any reason for. But I don't think that's wrong. I just think that's where they are and where our culture is. I do think that social media and other things going on in our world have coarsened the conversation, including the conversation that is usually nonverbal between an audience and a play. You see people doing like weird things now that you would never. I mean, I was at a play and somebody in the audience, first of all, had their phone on, which, is annoying and not allowed. And there was I guess their phone was running out of power, and there was a socket on stage on the set that I guess they thought was real, and they went up onto the stage and plugged in their phone while the play was happening. I mean, there's sort of a loss of understanding and of the contract between audience and the theater that I do find disturbing, and also the response afterward on social media uh, really is too often grotesque and really about the expression of anger that I think, I'll just say this without getting too political, I think the fish rots from the head.
It Gail has a question that I really want to make sure we get in here. She says, now that some time has passed, I'm wondering how you see Here We Are in the context of Stephen Sondheim's career.
What a great question. So for other people listening, Here We Are was a musical that was posthumously produced with a score by Stephen Sondheim, the great, maybe greatest American musical theater writer of the last 60, 70 years. And I gave it a very positive review, influenced, and I think this is what the questioner is suggesting, in part by wanting there to be another Sondheim show. And I was so glad that even though he had died, the people who had been working on it with him found a way to finish the show. And I did enjoy it. It was a beautifully made production, really incredibly chic and interesting. And the songs that existed in it were quite good. Although, to be honest, were they up to the standard of his best scores? Not quite. But to be a bit lower than the standard of Sondheim at his best is to be at a very high standard. So I wasn't pretending when I said it was a worthy Sondheim score, even if it wasn't top drawer. But will it stand the test of time? Will it be produced frequently? That I can't say. It was experimental, and then one of the experimenters died. And they did a beautiful job of completing it, but I don't know whether it can stand on its own going ahead.
Rebecca asks, are you able to speak on what shows you think have had the most impact or have most impacted theater in the past few years and why?
Well, that's a big question and really good one, and maybe something I should write about. But okay, so I'm going back a ways to give an example from an earlier era. Angels in America by Tony Kushner, the two-part play about, well, many things, including AIDS and America, was epochal but both as a cultural representation of a moment, but also in terms of playwriting and Broadway. And what the questioner is really asking is, has there been anything more recent than that has been, that has served the same function? And among musicals, possibly so. Yes, Hamilton, um, something that was a cultural behemoth and continues to play on Broadway and has spread throughout the world, and has changed the way people think about what a musical can be. And also, I have to say, has changed the way people think about what diversity can mean in terms of telling the American story. So I guess for musicals, there is such a work. For plays, no, I can't think of one since Angels in America. I mean, of course, there's been marvelous plays, wonderful, powerful works, but none that have altered the culture in the way that I think the question is asking.
Susan Brady has a question here that intrigues me, and I think a lot of people uh, wonder about this. She says, how do you prevent the mood that you're in when you go into the theater from affecting your critique of a performance?
I don't really need to do that because after all these years, I still love going into a theater. I pretty much forget whatever just happened, a bad meal or an argument with my husband, or something annoying a reader wrote to me. I get a smile on my face. I get my nice seat, and I have to tell you, I get really good seats, so that's nice. And I sit there with a stupid smile on my face in anticipation of what I hope will be a great time. So I don't really have that problem until the play starts. And if it's like not being what I would like it to be, or if I'm not having a great time at the play, then yes, I have to deal with my mood, but the mood has been created by the work itself. Mostly, I still have the feeling I had when my parents took me to the Forest Theater, I think it was, or in Philadelphia to see Fiddler on the Roof when I was 7 years old.
Terry Frischman has a question here that I think is very important. She says, which women of the theater are being rediscovered now?
Um, well, the pause you're hearing from me is that I'm in my 60s now and I forget names. And I could go and look this up, but I don't want to leave the screen. There was a black woman playwright from the 60s, who had a play that never got to Broadway, being done on Broadway about 2 years ago. That was fantastic. And she has another play off Broadway coming this season called Wine in the Wilderness. And as soon as the name comes back to me, I will share it with you. There's another black woman playwright named Adrienne Kennedy, who is still alive, but whose work was kind of disappeared. I mean, along with a lot of other women, and particularly women of color, whose work is being done more often now. I will say my book, Shy, about Mary Rogers, I don't know whether it influenced the production of Once Upon a Mattress, which was a show she wrote in the 50s, to come back to Broadway, but it had a successful Broadway run this past year. I don't know if it's a rediscovery, but it was exciting for me. And there are smaller companies off Broadway that are devoted to finding plays that either never were done in New York or were done and then disappeared. They're often the works of women. And I wish I could give you the names right now, but afterward, I'll send a note to Dick with a list of these names, and he can share it.
Mary Frankel asks an interesting question. Does a Yiddish theater still exist in New York City? I took my mother to a performance many years ago, and the subtitles were in English and Russian, with most of the audience recent Russian immigrants. That spigot of immigrants is less prevalent. So has the audience for Yiddish theater disappeared?
No, no, there's still one or two companies that do Yiddish theater, still often with the Russian subtitles as well as English. There was recently an extremely powerful production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, which I saw. And I mean, I've always loved that show anyway. I'm a sucker for it. But to hear it in the language that my own grandparents spoke was extremely powerful. And it moved and had a nice long run. So yeah, there is still a small audience for Yiddish theater, but it's mostly not Yiddish speakers. Or Yiddish is their second language or their cultural antecedent language. And occasionally one of those shows will get a lot of attention because of one thing or another. Obviously, Fiddler on the Roof was a novelty. To hear those familiar songs, but with Yiddish lyrics was kind of thrilling.
Asha has a question here that I think is interesting. She says, I'm curious about whether your mind has ever been changed about a show after you've written about it, whether because you read a different review that changed your perspective after the fact, or because you saw it again more than once.
Yes, it's not that common, and it wouldn't really be because another critic wrote, in a different vein about the same work. I do read other critics after I'm finished, and I am enlightened by them, but they're having a different point of view from mine is an enjoyable uh, element. But like I've said regarding readers, it's not dispositive. It's that's their take. That's great. It helps me understand mine, which is different. However, I saw a show called Appropriate 10 years ago by a playwright named Brandon Jacobs Jenkins. And I really disliked it. And I was a critic at New York Magazine at the time, and I wrote quite a negative review of it. I thought it was a mess, and was basically it was a play about the buried secrets of racism in America as experienced by a white family who discover terrible artifacts of racism in the ancestral home in the South. And to me, the family mishegas just overwhelmed the historical mishegas to a point that I found it silly. The play was revived a year and a half ago, and on Broadway. And I saw it. Well, I think it was off Broadway first, and then it moved to Broadway. And I saw it, and I loved it. Now, 10 years had gone by, but the play was, I mean, he had rewritten it slightly, but that wasn't it. It was a much better production, so that helped. But I don't want to take myself off the hook here. I think part of what happened is that I saw his work and his subsequent work, and I learned from it. And he gave me access to a new way of thinking that allowed me to see the same material with more nuance. It also had an amazing central performance that certainly helped. But yes, it does happen. It's just pretty rare. And I wonder if if listeners here think back on their own histories, how much it has ever happened that they've switched from really disliking something to really liking something, or vice versa. Probably not that much.
Lynn Biondi has a great question, and I think this is probably a good note for us to end on this morning. She says, a challenge of New York City Broadway theater is the cost of tickets. It is prohibitive to many people, yet as discussed, the cost of most performances is not covered by ticket sales. What could be done to make theater more accessible to broader audiences?
Well, there are lots of things that the industry has tried to do, and some of which are quite successful in their way. There's the TKTS booth, which offers half-price tickets to shows, but you can't plan ahead on that. You can only buy those the day of, and even half price. Some of these shows are not really feasible. Many shows have rush tickets, have lotteries, have under age 25 special tickets set aside. But these are attempts at fixes that are not dealing with the systemic problem. The systemic problem is that, unlike almost any other advanced culture in the world, the United States does not support the arts very well, and it certainly does not support theater very well. You could argue that the commercial theater shouldn't need government support, but if, as I said, 2/3 of all shows, even commercial shows, fail, so something's needed. I think the solutions that producers are trying now are to have smaller plays, that smaller casts, smaller sets, or they have a big celebrity who can give up 13 weeks to 16 weeks to make a show succeed. But I don't think those are actually solutions, because some of our stories are big. Some of our stories need a cast of 30. Some of our stories need amazing sets, and not just for entertainment, but for insight. So I don't actually see a solution unless there's a change in the social contract and the government contract about the value of theater and the other arts. And to be honest, I don't see that coming.
All right. So, Jessica, I want to thank you for a really interesting and informative and entertaining period. This was a great act of kindness on your part, and
it was a pleasure.
I'll never forget it. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing your ideas and insights. And I'd like to thank the many members of our audience who came from all over the country today and asked some great questions. So thank you so much for being with us. I hope you'll keep an eye on what we're doing in the future, and I will continue to be an interested and devoted reader. So thank you.
Thank you, Dick. It was a great pleasure, and your listeners are great too.